following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Welcome once again to Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name is Claire Hall, and I am glad to welcome back this week. It's our very first two-part interview on Ask Claire, but this is a man with a lot of great stories to share, the author of a whole shelf full of books, including many wonderful baseball books, Peter Golenbock. And Peter, how are you today?
I'm just fine. How are you?
Oh, wonderful. I really enjoyed on our last program learning about how you came to write Dynasty, history of the Casey Stengel, Ralph Houck Yankees, and some of the fantastic stories you shared about meeting the Yankee greats of that era. And then we heard about how that led to you collaborating with Sparky Lyle on the highly entertaining and controversial bestseller, The Bronx Zoo. But really, that was the first of many collaborations you ended up doing with Yankee players. And please, share some of those other projects that you were involved with.
Well, one of the most interesting things about that book was that originally I was going to call that book As the Clubhouse Turns, because the Yankees was such a soap opera.
Oh yeah.
And I still think that would have been an apropos title for it.
Totally. Yep.
But one day, my editor, he says to me, I think I've got a better title for this. I think we should call this The Bronx Zoo. And I thought about it, and I said, that's just sheer genius.
Yep.
I mean, that's just sheer genius. And the funny thing was that he was just an editor, and some of the uppers at the publishing house were saying to him, the people in the sales department were saying to him, if you call this thing The Bronx Zoo, people are going to think that this book belongs in with the animals, books about animals. And he very wisely said, if we don't call this The Bronx Zoo, I quit.
Oh, wow.
And they didn't want him to quit because he was a very good editor. And so we called this thing The Bronx Zoo. And as they say, the rest is certainly history. And there was even a movie. It was one of these crime movies where at the end the evidence had something to do with the Bronx Zoo, and they were looking for the evidence at the zoo in New York, and the evidence ended up under home plate at Yankee Stadium.
Oh, wow.
So I thought that was pretty neat. But what happened was after that book came out, it was Billy Martin's agent who had contacted me and talked me into doing this book with Sparky. And so after The Bronx Zoo came out, Billy now was this was before he was hired to be manager of the Oakland A's. And so we had time to work together. He lived in New Jersey, and I lived in New Jersey, and I would travel over to see him, and we would go to various bars where we would talk.
Why does that not surprise me?
but the thing that did surprise me was that the entire time we talked, he never had one drink. Not one.
Wow.
He had club soda and lime every time we met, because apparently, I guess, he felt that his drinking had been responsible this time for his getting fired from the Yankees, and he wanted to, be on a more straight path, and so he wasn't drinking at all. Also, at the time, he was not working for Steinbrenner, and so that pressure, Steinbrenner put terrible pressure on him, because Steinbrenner always believed that Steinbrenner was smarter than Billy was, which drove Billy absolutely stark raving mad. And so Billy and I, we wrote number 1. That was his number on the back of his uniform, and it was a terrific book. And after I finished writing the book, I actually rode with the Oakland A's team for about 4 weeks, because I was not going to hand that book in until Billy read every word that I wrote and signed his name at the end of every chapter.
Oh, wow.
But the one thing that I did not want It happened in one of Reggie Jackson's books. Reggie did a book with a writer, and when Reggie was criticized for some of the things that were in the book, Reggie said, "I never said any of that. He made it up," or something like that. And I was gonna make sure that was not going to happen to me. And so I flew with the Oakland team. It was so much fun. Traveling with a major league ball club is just so wonderful. Great young kids. It was just, it was great. And Billy, of course, is a total hoot. And he was the smartest manager of all the managers. And wherever Billy went, he would take a team and make it into a competitive, challenging team. And it was just so much fun to watch. And his players, I had a chance to, sit in the dugout with his players and talk to his players. And they would tell me, how much they respected Billy and how he had taken the team and transformed it into a contender. And it had. When Billy was in Oakland, they started calling it Billy Ball.
Oh,
he could have run for governor of the state of California if he had wanted to. He had been so successful. But, of course, with Billy, the only job he ever wanted was to be the manager of the Yankees.
yes.
And so despite all his success in Oakland at the end of his second year, Steinbrenner calls him up on the phone and says, "If you can get yourself fired, I want to hire you to come back to the Yankees." And sure enough, that's what happened. Billy tore up his office and called the owner some bad names to get himself fired. And about a week after that, he was hired to be the manager of the Yankees, I think, for the third time. Yeah. Ultimately, he was the manager of the Yankees 5 times. But Billy had a sickness. Aside from being somewhat of an alcoholic, his sickness was that he was a Yankee-holic.
Yeah.
The only job he ever wanted was to be the manager of the Yankees. And it's just a shame because he could have been the manager for Oakland for 10 years if he had wanted to be.
Exactly.
I mean, they just loved him out there. But he couldn't stay away from the Yankees, and he came back. And, of course, George never changed. George would always say, "Oh, I'm going to change this time. I won't bother you like I bothered you before." And quite frankly, every time Billy would come back, George would act worse.
Wow. Yeah.
George was like Trump. George was a narcissist. George always felt that he was the smartest person in the room, that he knew more than the general managers, and he knew more than the managers. And the other thing, of course, the reason he and Trump are so similar is that he always wanted to have his name in headlines in the papers every single day. And so he would do things like, fire Billy's pitching coach, or scream at Reggie Jackson, or ultimately with Steinbrenner, he and Dave Winfield had a spat where some reporter had said that Winfield had gotten the better of George in a negotiation, in that George didn't realize that Winfield had a when the country's resources go up, his salary goes up. Standard of living. He had a standard of living clause in the contract that George apparently didn't know about. And so when somebody was getting the better of George, just like Trump, George did everything he could. He would go in the papers and say the worst things about Winfield, except that Dave was tough as nails, and Dave had a no-trade clause, so there was absolutely nothing that Steinbrenner could do to Dave except, say nasty things about him in the newspapers. And Winfield, like I said, was tough as nails, would come back and say nasty things about Steinbrenner in the newspaper. But it got to the point where Steinbrenner was so intent. He wanted to throw Dave Winfield in jail, is what he wanted to do. Trump with his lock 'em up nonsense.
Yep.
Well, Steinbrenner was something of the same way. So Winfield had a foundation. And so Steinbrenner found a guy named Howie Spira, a slime ball, who went to Steinbrenner and said, "I can tell you things about the Winfield Foundation where you can, really get to Winfield. So Steinbrenner said, I'll give you $100,000 for that information. And he actually paid him, I think, 60. So, like Trump, who promises you something and pays you half and then says, sue me for the other half, Steinbrenner did the same thing.
Yeah.
And so this time, Spira, not getting his other $40,000, went to the press, told on him.
Aha, yes.
At which point the commissioner suspended Steinbrenner first for life and then for 2 years.
And wasn't that George's second suspension?
Second time, yeah. Well, the first time George had given money to Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, but did it in an illegal way.
Yeah.
Rather than you were only allowed to give a certain amount of money, and so he got 8 of his employees from his shipping company to send the Nixon campaign $2,000. So Steinbrenner paid each of the 8 $2,000, and each of the 8 wrote checks for $2,000. He got caught. So Bowie Kuhn was the commissioner at that time, suspended Steinbrenner for life, and again he served 2 years.
Yep.
And during those 2 years, Gabe Paul built the Yankees into a winner, because as long as Steinbrenner was the owner, he wasn't going to allow any rookies ever to come up to the Yankees. So they traded away all those rookies for guys who were past their prime but had, name recognition. And so, for 30 years, the Yankees never won. They won during the time, right after the time he was suspended the first time, when they won in 76, 77, 78, 81. And then when he was suspended the second time, he would have traded, the fivesome of Derek Jeter and of Bernie Williams and of Pettit and of Mariano Rivera, and the catcher would have traded those 5 guys away, but he wasn't there. So during those 2 years, those 5 guys came to fruition and became stars, and the Yankees were able to win in the 90s because Steinbrenner was banned from being part of the Yankees for those 2 years.
Wow.
I don't know how I got off on that, but that was from from being with Billy and watching the way he and Steinbrenner carried on, and so when Billy died on Christmas Day of 1989.
Oh yeah.
Immediately, the first thing, I got a phone call from my agent, who said, you've got to write Billy's biography.
Wild, High, and Tight.
Yeah,
Yes.
Wild, High, and Tight it was. And
great title.
And the people who Billy was friendly with were wonderful, just wonderful. Bill Reedy was his closest friend, and Bill Reedy had been in the truck with Billy on the day Billy died.
Oh wow.
And everybody was saying, of course, what happened that particular day was that Billy was driving the truck and crashed it into a pipe. He was trying to get out of this ditch he was in.
Uh-huh.
And he was maybe 500 feet from home. So if he had, turned the car off and just walked home, everybody would have been fine.
Yeah.
But Billy and Bill Reedy had been sitting in the bar drinking since, 10 o'clock in the morning, and Billy was in no mood to be stuck in a pipe, and so he floored it, smashed into the end of the pipe, and broke his neck and died. And what happened upon impact was that Billy slid behind Reedy. Reedy was crunched up into the front of the truck, and Billy slid behind him. And Reedy, who loved Billy, dearly, thought to himself, when the cops come, if they find out that Billy was drunk when he was driving, that's not going to be a good thing. And so Reedy, in great pain, his hip was broken, I think, pulled himself over to the driver's side. And so when the cops did come, the first question was, who was driving? And Reedy, in order to protect Billy, said, I was driving.
Wow. Okay.
Which enabled Billy's wife, who was interested more in Billy's money than anything else, to sue the Ford Motor Company and Reedy for $1 million.
Ooh. Ford
ended up settling. Didn't cost Billy anything, but that one thing where he said, I was driving, cost the Ford Motor Company basically $1 million. But when I interviewed Reedy at great length and so many of his other friends, it's all in there in Wild, High, and Tight. So the first sentence of my book was Billy Martin was driving.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
That grabs you. That pulls you right into
Yeah.
the whole amazing, tragic story of Billy Martin.
Without a doubt.
And Peter, could we move to, I believe, am I correct, the only piece of fiction on your bookshelf, which is a novel called Seven about Mickey Mantle.
Yep.
And I've got to admit that I approached it as a reader with maybe a little trepidation because it received such, how can I say it, amazing mixed reviews. But,
it got the conservatives. The conservatives of this world trashed this book. This book should have sold 100,000 books.
Oh, I loved the book, and it should have been, and that was so unfair because, tell us the concept, tell us, what you were trying to accomplish with Seven, the Mickey Mantle novel.
Well, through my friendship with Billy, I also got to know Mickey very, very well.
Yeah.
And of course, I had interviewed Mickey for Dynasty and interviewed so many of his teammates and heard them talk with such glowing affection for Mickey. And I had that same glowing affection for him too. But Mickey was such an interesting character in that he had very, very low self-esteem.
Oh yeah.
I mean, he why do people care about me? Why do people think I'm so great? He had a father who was, I won't say he was a monster, but nothing Mickey ever did was ever good enough for dear old Dad. No matter how well he did, it wasn't good enough. And then, of course, when Mickey went to the Yankees and had Casey Stengel as his manager, Casey sort of became a surrogate father as well, and nothing Mickey could ever do was ever good enough for Casey as well.
Yeah.
Because they looked at this guy's potential. They saw his strength and his athleticism. And always what they would say is that Mickey Mantle should be better than he is. And as great as he was, nobody was satisfied with what he did. We always think he can be better. The guy was the MVP of the American League 3 times, for crying out loud.
Yeah, what more do you want?
In Mickey's, Casey Stengel would be standing there next to Mickey, and some reporter would say, "Who was the best player you ever managed?" And Stengel would say, "Joe DiMaggio," in front of Mickey.
Nice.
I mean, and nothing was ever good enough. And I, there were other things about Mickey that I found, and one of them. Tony Castro wrote a fantastic book called Joe D. and Mickey.
Yeah.
And you got to read this. It's just
okay.
One of the things I wrote about in Seven was that when Mickey first came up to the Yankees, he met this fabulous woman who was a dancer and a showgirl, and he fell in love with her, and he was going to marry her. But in '51. His father, on his deathbed, said to Mickey, "I want you to go home and marry Merlin. She's more your type. Promise me you'll marry Merlin."
Oh, my.
So Mickey did not marry the woman he loved.
Oh, my.
And, so how do you write all this? So Mickey was dead when I sat down to write it. So I thought to myself, let's do a book where Mickey Mantle is dead, and he goes to heaven, and he meets, and I had him meet the writer who did Ball 4 with Jim Bouton. His name was Leonard Schechter.
Yep.
So in this novel, I had him meet Leonard Schechter and tell Leonard Schechter the story of his life.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was a brilliant concept in itself. Yeah,
well, thank you.
I love that.
Thank you. I sort of got a kick out of it too.
Yeah,
because I knew Jim so well, and he spoke so highly of Schechter, And Schechter was the sort of person who only wanted the truth. He didn't want the, candy-coated nonsense. He wanted the truth.
Yep.
And so I thought, okay, this is a guy who's going to, somehow get Mickey Mantle to tell the truth. And so 7 is about as honest a book about who Mickey was as you'll ever read. It's exactly who he was. He had the marvelous sense of humor. He told the dirtiest, most wonderful dirty jokes you could ever imagine. And I had, I started off, I think, on page 2 with one of those jokes.
Yep.
Just to give people an idea of the sort of person he was. And apparently that offended, too many of the wrong people. It's a shame.
And that is a shame, because I hope anybody listening to this program, if you haven't picked up 7, you can still find it. I know it's at least available still in ebook form, and if you want a print copy, just go to Amazon or any of the book selling sites, because it's really, I think I remember publishing my review on Amazon and Goodreads, and essentially saying that, thinking that this is one of the times when fiction can come closer to giving you the reality of the totality of a person's life than any nonfiction account could, because it sounds like as wonderful, approachable, a great storyteller Mickey could be, that probably he didn't even have the depth of insights about his own character that I think you brought to the page, and what he had struggled with his whole life, and
probably
let alone being this small town kid from Oklahoma who finds himself barely an adult. Well, actually, he came up as a 19-year-old, didn't he, in 51?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, so a teenager playing for the most storied, successful team in baseball, the biggest media market in the country, the pressures just must have been absolutely unimaginable.
Right, and as you know, he started out not so well, and they sent him down to Kansas City that first year, and he thought he was finished.
Oh, yeah, and when he wanted to quit, you ought to share, Peter, if you would. I mean,
sure.
Talk about the moment when he calls up Mutt, his dad, and tells him, "I'm done."
Yeah, that's right. And Mutt drove up and said, "Okay, pack your bags, you're going home." My son, I don't have a son who's a quitter.
Yeah.
Basically shamed him into continuing to play, and so the rest is history. He went back to the Yankees.
Indeed.
Became one of the greatest players in the history of the Yankees. And part of that too is that the girlfriend also came down to Kansas City to visit him a few times, and that kept him sane too.
Yeah. An amazing life, in some ways a tragic life, and yet, the amazing, just one other story about Mickey. I suppose you've heard it, but, it wouldn't astonish people when they did. Some point in the mid-'60s, I believe, in a medical school, a teacher presented without the accompanying name, the history of Mickey Mantle's injuries in the major leagues, and the students were asked to give an assessment of this person's likely, I guess, ability to actively participate in life. Mm-hmm. Most of them assumed that this man would not even be able to walk, and when
that he'd be in a wheelchair. No, that's exactly right.
That he'd be in a wheelchair, and that when they were told that not only was he a major league player, but in fact this was Mickey Mantle, they were all astonished.
Astonished. His teammates were astonished. His teammates would go into the medical room there by the clubhouse and watch as they taped him up from not necessarily head to toe, but certainly from chest to toe. It was amazing. It was just amazing that he was able to play the last few years. He finally had to retire because he just, basically had difficulty running from home to first base.
Yeah.
And he had to quit. And that's the day he died, of course, the day he quit.
Oh, sure. Sure. And, I know some people had said, well, gee, it's too bad the designated hitter didn't come along a few years later. Or a few years earlier, that might have saved some wear and tear and prolonged his career. But like you said, just sad that he reached the point. I don't know if he would have stayed around or not because, like you said, he really couldn't even run anymore, which is sad to see.
That was certainly a problem. He was in a lot of pain.
Yeah.
He was in a lot of pain. I mean, the last 7 or 8 years of his life, he lived in Atlanta with another woman.
Yeah.
He wasn't in Dallas living with Merlin. He was, living with somebody else who was helping him to run his post-baseball, career, signing autographs. And he made as much money signing autographs the last few years as he did, playing for the Yankees, which was interesting. Then, of course, after he died, Merlin would not allow the woman to come to the funeral.
That's sad. Yeah, he and Merlin had never divorced, right? They were married till the day.
No, he wouldn't divorce her.
Died.
He would not divorce her, and she would not divorce him. Yeah.
Wow. Quite a story. Peter, believe it or not, we're already at the end of another half hour. It has been a pleasure, and I want to thank you for your generosity with your time. I hope people listening have enjoyed this as much as I have. Peter Golenbock, my guest on this edition of Ask Claire. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, happy trails.